Okay, and you are a development economist, lawyer, and chancellor of a university in your hometown in India. And your latest change from a UN senior official to the first director of a private charity foundation a year ago. So what attracts you in your new post? Or what can you more agilely do in UNDP that you can't expect to achieve, that you can expect to achieve in your new post?
Well, the new organization that I moved to is called the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet. It's a public foundation based in the United States with the headquarters in New York. The UN, I have been a UN official for a long time, almost 25 years when I left. And so I'm a UN alumni in that sense, and have great affection for what the UN does and what it is capable of. But the reason I left was that it was rather simple for me. The UN is a great place for supply side conversations. You know, you bring together the heads of states, heads of governments, or heads of corporations, or heads of banks, and you start a conversation. But the UN is not the place for a demand side conversation, which is where you have to be at the grassroots working with smallholder farmers or people or stakeholders or civil society organizations. And that's what doesn't happen at the UN at an actionable level. At a conversation level, everybody comes together, and the UN does a phenomenal job of convening people and rallying around a common theme or a common idea or a common aspiration. But when it comes to getting things done, you really have to be at the grassroots. You really have to work with smallholder farmers. You really have to work with people that can make a difference. You have to identify champions. You have to incubate their ideas. They need the support. Because what we have seen over the last 30 years is a self-defeating arrangement where we have a lot of conversations around who pays who is responsible for the situation. Now that's perfectly all right and a conversation that is important. But when your house is on fire, you don't spend time on arguing who put the fire on, rather than you go out and put all your efforts in finding the water or the fire brigade. So that's the situation the planet is in. And my tenure was coming to an end. So I didn't resign or leave the UN. My tenure was, I was the Assistant Secretary General for Environment, and these are political appointments. So my tenure was coming to an end. I did not take an extension. I said, well, I want to move on and to do something else. So I think, and 1 year later, I'm delighted I did that, because we have catalyzed some of the most significant ideas. We are on our way to achieving some of our goals that we set for the first 2 years. And then that's very important. And from that perspective, although the focus on climate action is a lot on the Western world, for the planet actually, what matters is what countries like China and India or Brazil, countries like these do, because this whole crisis is a man-made crisis. And then I say man-made with a purpose, because women didn't create this crisis. Women had very little influence on the policymaking process globally. So it is a man-made crisis. It has to be solved by the human beings. Although the women didn't create the crisis, they also have to contribute to the solution, as they always do. And then that's where the people are. If you take China or India or Brazil or the other bigger countries like Indonesia and others, which is the developing world, you have 50% of the world's population. So that's where we are focused. And that's what will ultimately decide if our efforts work or not. And then so that's why we decided to focus on smallholder farmers. We're working on some of the biggest ideas in India to support natural farming in India. And one of the programs we support has already converted 1 million farmers from synthetic chemical farming to natural farming. And natural farming is not organic farming. Organic farming is expensive because you need biofertilizers and all. In natural farming, you use the strength of the soil and the microbes and all that of nature to grow your food while staying within the threshold of renewal. That's why it's called regenerative agriculture. You use the soil, but you don't destroy it like synthetic chemical fertilizers and pesticides do. So there in the state of Andhra Pradesh, 1 million farmers have already changed practices, and they have a total of 6 million farmers. There are other states in India that we're working on. I was recently in Singapore discussing with key stakeholders on ocean action. What can we do together on a global scale? And Singapore being an island country and also a developed country. I mean, they're in the global south, but they're a developed country. And so there's a lot of ideas happening there. So I was there to talk to people young and old, experienced and enthusiastic, to see how we can actually work with each other to generate the kind of climate action we need to get over this, because we are fretting over new things every few months. Sometimes it's a hurricane, sometimes it's a forest fire, so but little realizing while they are all important and they are all significant and they deserve all our attention, but those are like flashes in the pan as compared to what climate change is doing to us and will do to us in the next 10, 20 years. So we really need to wake up to the biggest challenge that confronts humanity. And that's why we decided to do what we do at the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet.
You're right. That comes to my next question. Like, what is the attraction for private investment for public good? As you've witnessed in Indonesia, at the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility in 2016, and the Sustainable India Finance Facility in 2017. Could you give an example, and what is the government and regulators' role in climate finance?
It's extraordinary because that particular investment, it's a $400 million project. And it...
I'm sorry, there is a pause of which project is the Formula One?
The Indonesia one, $400 million, the first project there. It was a partnership with Michelin, the tire company, and their local subsidiary in Indonesia. It is extraordinary because that was the world's first 400 million scale project in protecting a forest. So there is this Bukit Tigapulu forest, which is Bukit Tigapulu means land of 30 wells. So it's about a 400,000 hectare forest, 6 times the size of the country Singapore. So there, about 20% of the forest was already gone, destroyed by illegal logging, poaching, and what have you. So what we did was we built a people-nature compact. So the project actually employs 16,000 people directly and 34,000 people indirectly through the secondary and tertiary sectors of the economy. And so Michelin runs the first ring of protection, which is about a 38,000 hectare rubber plantation, but a sustainable rubber plantation. It's the world's largest sustainable rubber plantation. And that employs all the people. The next ring is about 50,000 hectares, which is managed by the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So they are bringing that back again as a rainforest, as a conservation area. And so the partnership with the government is that the government is an enabler. The government has provided the land as a conservation concession, and a part of it is for production, and the part of it is for protection. And that then becomes two rings around the remaining forest that is now fully protected. So that's the model, and it is not a single penny of government money from the government of Indonesia. It's all private finance, and the private finance is also very concessional, because when you go to the market and you say, I want money for a rubber plantation, the market possibly gives you money at 12-13% interest. But if you go to the same market and say, I want to protect this forest, and the rubber plantation is just a tool for that protection, because the people that are being misused and misguided to destroy the forest also need livelihood, and their lives and livelihoods need to be protected. Their children need to find food on the table. They need to go to schools. They need to find healthcare. It's a very different narrative then, and people are willing to invest. So the first tranche of the investment was $95 million, which attracted investors from around the world. We raised the money through a corporate bond in Singapore, and all of it was subscribed. People bought the $95 million bond, which was the first tranche. And then, of course, now there has been second and others, and it is a thriving project because now it has been 6 years. So we know what it does. At that time, there was a lot of speculation whether this will work or not, but now we know it works. And the same thing in India, we brought the same idea to India, and we set up the Sustainable India Finance Facility, which is the one that supports the Andhra Pradesh project. And there, we built a partnership of about 50 organizations around what the government was already doing. So the project belongs to the government. It is their idea, their championship, working with the farmers. But by bringing in others, it built a fantastic coalition that brings all kinds of science, research, market expertise, everything into the equation. So much so that last year, the German Development Bank came forward and provided a loan of $300 million to the project at only 0.5% interest, which is way lower than even the rates at which the World Bank gives money to developing countries. And the German Development Bank put the money because they saw a promise. They saw that, okay, if this happens, if this works, then we have a solution that can be taken anywhere globally, that you can actually cultivate the land and make it healthier while still producing your food is an extraordinary idea, but not a new idea. This idea has been there forever. It needs support. Before we found nitrates and phosphates and phosphorus 100 years ago, this is how we did our agriculture. So it's just going back to the roots and strengthening the roots, both literally and metaphorically.
And those investments paid off, and it performs well as well.
Those investments pay off because I'll just give you an example. Currently, India spends $20 billion every year on fertilizer subsidies. $20 billion every year. And in Andhra Pradesh, that subsidy is roughly about, I would say about $550 million. So when you do a form of agriculture that does not use fertilizers, you're going to avoid those subsidies. And so that can then go on to pay the loan and the interest. And the interest is hardly anything. And the principal also can be paid because you're saving money on the subsidies. There is also Andhra Pradesh state, which is a big state. It's about 60 million people. In that state, all the farm electricity is paid for by the government. It is fully subsidized. So that is roughly about $1 billion a year. That's how much the subsidy is just for that one state. And so when they get $300 million at 0.5% interest, and natural farming needs much less water, actually. Much less water means much less pumping with the electric pumps that farmers use, which then turns to much less subsidies. So all the subsidies that are being saved can actually pay back the loan and still save some money for the government. So it's a win-win-win for everybody.
Yes, and you left Indonesia and India not only forest, but a good idea and a breakthrough, I think, in the financing mode.
Well, I mean, I stumbled upon the idea, but I also saw the power of the idea, and then I thought that, okay, this is what it takes. Then we should do more and more of it. And so now with the Global Alliance, we have catalyzed the idea of carbon negative farming, which is a combination of vertical and horizontal and greenhouse agriculture. So the idea is very simple. You take a piece of land, you keep 80% for forests, that does the nutrient recycling and recharging and everything else. In the remaining 20%, you create net zero agriculture, closed loop. Everything is processed on site. And nature does that for you. I mean, to give you an example, if you're doing aquaculture, for example, and so the fish you grow, you do the fillet, and all the waste then goes into a waste processing facility where that produces methane that can then go into running your temperature regulating equipment or air conditioners or whatever you call them for the greenhouses. And then the carbon that comes out, you can capture it and actually use it in the greenhouse. And the methane can run your compressors and others that can then run your cold storage. So you can actually do everything on site at scale. And just to give you an example, the one that we are setting up in Jamaica, that's the first one, which we launched at COP26 in Glasgow, is a $300 million project, already funded. And that, just as a comparison, if you did very good agriculture in 1 acre of land, in a very fertile land with a lot of natural resources and fertilizers, you will produce roughly 10 tons of tomatoes if you're growing tomatoes. In our farm, which we call Agri-Haven, you will actually grow 250 tons of tomatoes in 1 acre of land because it is vertical farming, so it's in stacks. And so there's a lot of technology already available. So we're also aggregating technology and bringing them together: aquaponic, hydroponic, aeroponic, greenhouse agriculture, agroforestry. So then the farm is already carbon negative instead of being carbon neutral. And then now we just have very recently we signed up something with the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, and then Ghana is also looking at it carefully. We're going to do something in Venezuela and also in India. So it's that thing is taken off, and we'll be doing this in many parts of the world while producing significant amounts of food without any pressure on the natural resources. And that's the way to go.
Nice.
And then,
so we leave it like.
So go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was thinking it was a very good idea to leave like 80% untouched, and then we only grow on the 20% so that there is ample margins for if you need to expand or if the nature wants to, absorb whatever it's produced that is not good for the nature.
Absolutely, we'll never expand. So that is written in stone. That's the formula. 20% for agriculture, 80% for Mother Nature, and even the agriculture is net zero. So that's the idea, and that's how it becomes carbon negative, because 80% of the land is actually sequestering carbon, and 20% is producing food with zero footprint. So when you combine both, the food is actually carbon negative.
And the production and the use are, equal and more significant than using the land in 100%.
That's right. That's right.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. If such pilots can expand in like China and India, it would be a major good news for the farmers and the governments.
I mean, China has some of the brightest examples around the world. If you look at the kind of ecosystem regeneration that happened in Inner Mongolia, it's extraordinary what they have achieved there. So and China does things in great scale and complexity, and so actually I often tell this, that China holds the key for really solving the climate crisis, and more recently some of the steps taken by China, even announcing that they'll be carbon neutral by 2060, is extraordinary, because the United States has promised to be carbon neutral by 2050, which is fantastic. But remember this, the United States emissions peaked in 1972. So if you peaked in 1972 and you'll be zero by 2050, you still had close to 80 years to do that. China hasn't peaked as yet, and they have still gone ahead and promised to be neutral by 2060. That's extraordinary.
We talk about ambition.
That's right.
And that's ambition. Yeah.
That's ambition. I mean, people don't understand this. China promised, the US promised 2050, China promised 2060. People don't understand what the difference is. The US emissions globally are 5 gigatons. Chinese emissions globally are 12 gigatons. It's 2.5 times that of the US already. And they haven't peaked. So the complexity is enormous. So technically, China will achieve. Yeah. China will achieve. So technically, China will achieve in 20 years what the US achieved in 80 years, if they both achieve, as per their promise, one by 2050 and the other by 2060. My guess is that the Chinese emissions will peak by around 2040. So China will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, which means in 20 years they'll achieve what the US will achieve in 80 years. That's the reality.
Well, you can never imagine what is the limits for the Chinese people.
I agree. It's a very disciplined and industrious people.
Yeah, we'll come to that of comparison of China and India. But let me first ask you, as to take your perspective as economist, and and you see a lot of data in the UN system. So when we talk about fighting climate change, your perspective seems to very much focusing on agriculture. But you've already led the deforestation campaign, which is not very well. But instead of coal, renewable energy, forests, transport, and so on. So could you elaborate on each of the sectors I mentioned and their potential and effectiveness in fighting climate change?
So each of them are equally important. There's no one versus the other, right? So you have the energy transition that is happening, which is transport, which is energy production and distribution and consumption. And so all of that if you put in one pot, it is bigger than agriculture. But I'm not interested in agriculture or forests for what they emit at this time. Agriculture and food systems are about 40% of the emissions, global emissions. If you take all emissions pertaining to the food systems, it's about 40%, because that will include the transportation, the processing, the warehousing, the production, the fertilizers. But that's what we do for our food system. They don't happen in isolation. Because we need food, all these things happen. So it's about 40% of the global emissions, which is big. And that needs to change. But what excites me about soil and earth is that the potential for sequestration. We just don't need to prevent emissions, we also need to sequester, because we are currently at 420 parts per million of carbon concentration in the atmosphere, which is the long-term metric that should worry us very much, because the last time we were at 420 parts per million was 5 million years ago. And so that's worrying, because that's what creates all the dominoes. The ice melt, the Arctic ice sheets breaking away. This summer, the Arctic having 27 degrees Celsius temperature, it's unheard of. That's like a normal place, 27 degrees Celsius, and that's happening in the Arctic. So these are the things that really need to hold our attention. And then that's why the promise of soil, as you would know, soil has the capacity to store 3 times as much carbon as is in the atmosphere. So while the energy transition makes us a much more efficient economy, a much more resource efficient one, but it does not sequester carbon, right? It prevents from what is going out. It makes it less perhaps, or even makes it zero in some cases. But agriculture will not only you prevent emissions, so there's the mitigation, but there's also the adaptation. Because if you look at the way agriculture has gone in the last 100 years with chemical fertilizers, is that in most parts of the world, the soil organic carbon, which should ideally be about 2.5%, has fallen to below 0.5%. So some scientists tell us that we are actually 50 harvests away from not being able to grow anything. So there's an urgency to really bring back our soils. And what natural farming does is that it brings back our soil. It switches from soil chemistry, which is chemical fertilizers and everything else, to soil biology, which is healthy soils. And healthy soils produce healthy food, produce healthy humans. So it's a virtuous cycle that helps everybody, not just the humans and Mother Earth, but all the other species. What we are seeing in Andhra Pradesh is that birds are coming back to nest in agricultural fields. Bees are coming back on their own in the trees that are planted on the margins of the agricultural land, which is extraordinary, because bees fled the agricultural land decades ago, because they started dying from the colony collapse disorder, which happens when you are using the kind of chemicals that you use in pesticides, and that kills the bees. And so that's why they disappeared literally from our agricultural landscapes. But now in Andhra Pradesh, we see that they're coming back in the thousands of places. There are bees everywhere. That's bringing back nature. And then people say, oh, you are not putting chemical fertilizers. How will you grow the food? And they ask the false questions. So my counter question to them is, have you ever been to a forest? And if you have you asked the question, who puts the fertilizer here? Nobody. Forests are a cyclical, natural process. And because humans haven't happened to forests, forests grow and thrive. When we come there, we destroy everything. So we need to do something similar to our agriculture so that agriculture can be sustainable, agriculture can be healthy, it can be regenerative. And so we can actually grow our food without hurting the soil or the life forms that are inside the soil. There are millions of microbes in every cubic meter of soil you pick up. So there's no need to hurt them. They actually are there to help us.
I agree. And it's a very powerful question that you put to those forest doubters.
Well, I mean, this is a fact. That's the science.
So as a yeah, it is. So in terms of a cost effectiveness, like we have 3 areas in fighting climate change, right? It's some people focusing on impact, on public education. Secondly is on adaptation, and thirdly is on mitigation. So you've been on a UN position. So which one would you think generate most benefits? Maybe it's country specific. I don't know. But if I invest $1,
no, you're absolutely right. It is country specific. In highly industrialized countries, let's say the G7, there the mitigation efficiency is far more important than the adaptation efficiency, because their emissions are far greater in mitigation. And so if you can mitigate more, then that's better in those countries. But massive countries like China, or Russia, or India, or Indonesia, or Brazil, which are, yes, they are industrialized, and of course, there again, from each country to country, the level of industrialization differs. China, of course, is at the head of the pack, but at the same time, China is also equally big on agriculture and adaptation. So adaptation is about people. Adaptation is about all the species surviving. Adaptation is about biodiversity. And so that's equally important. And actually even more important, because for the last 30 years, we have been very focused on mitigation, whereas the solution lies in adaptation. Because if you're talking about mitigation, it is very difficult. Let me give you the example of India. Globally, it is said by the IPCC and other scientists that a 2.1 tons per capita footprint, carbon footprint, is ideal, because then the world will be sustainable, right? So currently in India, the per capita footprint is 1.9 tons. So how do you convince the Indian Prime Minister that he needs to do something? Because then he'll turn around and tell you, okay, you're telling me 2.1 is the ideal, I'm at 1.9. Why are you even talking to me?
I can sell you, right? I can sell you more tons. I can make money on that instead of,
absolutely,
instead of doing anything.
I am under the ideal footprint, whereas the US is 16. And there are some countries that are 20. And so the challenge is that when you make these mitigation arguments, they have very little basis for action. Now, of course, you can say that, well, the house is on fire, we should all put out the fire together. That's good. But then you should provide the money because you benefited from the economic growth. And that's the countries of the global north promised to put $100 billion a year by 2020. That's the Paris Agreement. And 2020 has come and gone. We are in 2022. And even cumulatively, forget every year, even cumulatively, they haven't produced $100 billion. They produced roughly about 20 billion cumulatively. That doesn't, and now they're doing creative accounting saying, oh, even if a business comes and invests, that's also our contribution. Everything is, or ODA is also our contribution. That's not how you do it. If the house is really on fire, then everybody needs to be honest. Everybody needs to be truthful. So that's the challenge, So that's one part. But when you do adaptation really resonates with political leaders of these big countries, because there you're talking about clean food, improvements in public health, improvements in prosperity for the people. To give you an example, in natural farming, the cost of cultivation drops by almost 60% because you are not using chemical fertilizers anymore, which is the biggest component in conventional agriculture. You're using less water, and your agricultural producers are more resilient. If you take chemically grown tomatoes, and once you take them off the plants and keep them somewhere, in 3 to 4 days time, they completely get destroyed and they perish. But if you take naturally farmed tomatoes and you keep it somewhere, easily for 2 to 3 weeks, nothing happens to them because there's no chemical in it. So it's the same thing. I mean, in the easiest example I can think of is a human being that is consuming a lot of drugs. And then when that human being stops consuming any drugs and does, healthy things like go on a walk, climb mountains, go on a swim, eat healthy food, they don't need any drugs. So it's the same thing with plants. They are also living beings. So I think all three are equally important, and education is even more important. And I'm so glad that young people are doing that so well, which we and my generation have failed spectacularly. So the young people are really bringing focus back on the climate, on the environment, and many of them are under 18 years of age. But once they get to the 18 years of age, which is the voting age in most countries, then they will demand action through the ballot box. And that, if you look at the European Parliament, this particular parliament has the maximum number of environmentally inclined members in the House. So the ground is shifting, and that's why it is so important, because our children are going to save us. That's my hope.
Okay. Now we are between India and China. There are much similarities in the fight of climate change, such as a large and relatively underdeveloped population, food security, population affected by sea level change, among others. So what would be your suggestions to China? Focusing on adaptation or mitigation, or focusing on agriculture like India?
China should focus on all, but I think the biggest power China has in this climate conversation is that of finance. China has shown the world either through partnerships like the BRICS Bank, which is called the New Development Bank, NDB, or the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, AIIB, and others. So China has been able to either contribute to or create these major financial institutions that are helping support climate action around the world. And so China has the financial might to actually shift that landscape and take a leadership role in that process. So I think that's where China's greatest strengths can be utilized in supporting climate action. And of course, what China does internally has significant ramifications around the world as well, both in terms of changing things on the ground for the people in China itself. We have seen what happened around the Olympics, how the black skies or the brown skies turned to blue skies. That's what is the power of political leadership, because what we are lacking globally is honest political leadership in terms of getting things done. Now you can have debates around this form of government, that form of government, and all, but that's for the politicians or the political analysts. For me, as a climate activist, I will go to anybody who is able to deliver climate action, because even more than the governments we have and the different shapes and forms of the way governments work, that's a nice debate. But we are in a crisis of epic proportions. And so let's focus on the crisis at hand. Let's focus on real action where it is happening and the real ability of countries to actually deliver on a promise that is so consequential to the survival of humanity.
Yes, and is this part of the reason that attracts you to SIISC conference today? Do you have any expectations attending the conference?
Well, I mean, the SIISC conference and other conferences like this, what they do is they bring back the spotlight on what needs to happen and to focus on what is important and not be lost by mundane things or minor things that look like big, you know. So I was speaking to a young girl students at the Delhi Entrepreneurship University recently, and I was telling them, I said, as much as you might think that some marriage between two Bollywood celebrities is so important that you should all be gushing about it, but your life doesn't depend on it. Your life depends on how the climate becomes in the next 5 or 10 years. So it's an engineering university. So I was telling them that you are young female engineers that are about to graduate, and so you really need to focus on what is important to the world, while that can be a nice distraction, who's getting married to whom in Bollywood, but that is certainly not what is existential. What is existential is the climate challenge.
Exactly, I agree with you. And you are very vocal amid all the UN officials. And I saw one of your talks, the opening remarks on the Green Tech Conference London in November last year. You said there are very powerful people lying, telling lies in Glasgow.
Everybody's lying.
At the same time, yeah. And you're entirely, yes, and you are entirely urging people to take action since 1992, the Rio Summit. It's been 30 years. So have you seen any moments of hope and how those moments are gone?
No, those moments are not gone. I see moments of hope every day. Every day I speak to 8 or 10 young startups that reach out to me through social media or LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook, and I speak with them. And some of those ideas are extraordinary. And you talk to them, you give them hope, you support them. So ultimately, a problem created by 8 billion people is not going to be solved by a few governments and corporations. And so we have to solve our own problems. And so I see hope everywhere. What I meant at the Green Tech Festival, was that I don't see hope in our leaders, because everybody goes and promises something that they have no intention of doing. That's lying. What else is lying? If you tell that to your children, they will laugh at you. Because if you tell them, I'm going out in the next 5 minutes, and then you are actually going inside the house, then of course they will think you are lying. It's simple.
Yeah, my question is on the, the opportunities missed, like the raté. All the chances that are wasted and missed. Yeah,
it is. We have wasted 30 years, I will say, with very incremental progress, and that is certainly an important conversation. So I'm not saying that any of those conversations is not useful, but the point is we have missed the point. And the real point of this whole conversation should have been about how do we solve the climate change problem, not about who should pay whom to blame. That doesn't work. And we have great examples of collective action. If you look at the ozone hole, now that has been plugged thanks to the Montreal Protocol. And that's one of the most successful climate conventions. We agreed on what needs to be done. And we immediately came together. We put up the resources and we found the technology. We moved from chlorofluorocarbons to hydrofluorocarbons. And we pretty much have solved that problem. So
and why has this worked and not the others?
Because we didn't get the engineers and the scientists into the room, we got the politicians into the room. That's
so
why.
you think scientists and the engineers are the hope?
Absolutely. You know, if you, I was recently writing a bit about the physics Nobel laureate Sven Arrhenius, who got the Nobel Prize in 1903. So in 1902, he was the one that first found that CO2 is forming in the atmosphere and creating a refractive layer that prevents the sun's radiation from going back to the space. And so that's how long the science has been there. And then, of course, in the 60s, Keeling came along and he put further evidence to that theory. But we knew as far as back in 1902 that CO2 concentration is going to get us to the situation we are in.
That's the classic example.
Yes, absolutely.
And how we missed the opportunity and the time window.
Right, you know? Exactly. And then actually, Arrhenius predicted that it will be a few cycles of 10,000 years by when the Earth will be baked. Actually, we have baked ourselves in a little more than 100 years. Forget 10,000 years and forget a few cycles.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your time, Satya. And I hope that we can speak sooner. Okay, next time.
Pleasure. Thank you, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Satya. Bye-bye.